Good afternoon. I am delighted to begin our program conversation today. I hope you had a lively and engaging conversation over lunch. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Roger Ferguson. His full biography is available on your tables. Roger is the president and CEO of TIAA, the Fortune 100 financial services firm that is the leading provider of retirement services in the academic, research, medical, and cultural fields. TIAA is a family of companies that includes Chicago's own based Nuveen. Roger oversaw TIAA's acquisition of Nuveen Investments in 2014. Today, all of TIAA's asset management business operates under the Nuveen brand, which manages $1 trillion of assets for investors around the world. Roger was previously the vice chair of the board of governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve System. On 9/11, he was the only federal governor in Washington. He will go down in history for the calm handling of his duties during this crisis. His actions kept the U.S. financial system functioning and reassured the world the U.S. economy would not be paralyzed. Before joining TIAA in 2008, Roger served at the head of financial services for Swiss Re. Earlier in his career, he was a partner at McKinsey & Company and an attorney at Davis, Polk & Wardwell. Roger holds a BA, JD, and PhD in economics, all from Harvard University. Roger serves on corporate boards of Alphabet, the parent of Google, General Mills, and International Flavors and Fragrances. He is also generous with his time, serving on the board as a member of the Smithsonian Institute, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He was a member of President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness and the Economic Recovery Advisory Board. You will learn from our conversation today that Roger is a man of intelligence, integrity, and thoughtful leadership. He is highly respected and admired by his colleagues and peers, and he leaves an indelible mark on organizations that he leads. Please warmly welcome Roger Ferguson. Thank you.
It was very generous. Thank you very much.
I wrote it myself.
No, it was very generous. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. We are delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that kind introduction. I'm not sure what to say. My wife would have been proud, and my kids would have thought you were talking about somebody else.
So let me tell you what we'd like to accomplish today. I'd love to spend a few minutes in learning about your background, the journey that brought you where you are today. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your experiences professionally, and also have an idea of how you live a life of purpose and consequence, because this is something I hear from everybody that works with you, that this is a product of what you do every day.
Oh,
that's not too ambitious an agenda for the next 50 minutes, is it? Good.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks.
So let's start at the very beginning of the journey. I know you grew up in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. Your mom was a public school teacher.
Right.
Your dad was a government employee.
Right.
Can you kind of give us some of the highlights of the formative steps in those early years?
Absolutely. So you've gotten the basics right. My mother was a public school teacher in the D.C. school system. My father was a civilian employee of the Army. He made maps. He was a cartographer. cartographer. But what really, I think, helped me and differentiated us a little bit from others was the things that my parents really were passionate about. With my mother, it's obvious. She was passionate about education. Anyone who was a school teacher obviously should be. And she instilled in us this notion that one should stay in school as long as possible. I don't think she thought I'd stay in school till I was 30, but nevertheless, there I was. And so that is what one of the many gifts she gave me. My father was a very interesting person. He had grown up in the Depression, and the Depression got him very interested in banks and these institutions that could throw the entire country into a depression with the 25% unemployment rate. And he became very fascinated with things like interest rates. He didn't have any money to speak of. $500, $1,000 was a lot of money for us. But he'd keep track of CD rates across all the local banks. And he'd ask me, I'm Roger Ferguson, Jr. At home I was and still am known as Junior. He'd say, Junior, should we move this money over to this other bank for like 25 basis points? We would sit down and watch this TV show that was called Wall Street Week with a guy named Louis Rukeyser. And we'd watch this thing on our little black and white TV as though we had $1 million. And we'd be talking about the market up and down. So when other dads would talk to their kids about, their sons in particular, about sports scores, my father was talking about the state of the markets. And I became fascinated with interest rates, among other things. But more importantly, it was what we now know as financial literacy, and I learned a lot of that around the kitchen table. And my father even had me, balancing the checkbook in the 7th and 8th grade. Unlike many dads, he would let me know how much he made. Many fathers were not willing to talk about money. So I just grew up in a household where it was all about education and a lot of financial literacy in a very matter-of-fact, day-to-day, this is what you do life. And that has stayed with me ever since.
So if I was fortunate enough to be able to join you for dinner one night, what would be the conversation that we would have together?
It would have a couple of features to it. One was a question they'd always ask me, which is, what did you learn today? Mm-hmm. So you can imagine, as a little kid in school, you think, wow, that was great. As a teenager, you think, oh, really? You want to talk to me? And then as I got older, and only recently did I appreciate the value of that question, because it suggests two things. One is you should be learning something every day, which I still think about at the end of every day. What did I learn? What can I do a little bit better today? And the other was it showed that they really cared about how I was progressing and developing. I won't surprise you, still am a pretty nerdy person, and I did pretty well in school. So they were less interested in the grades than the substance of it and the ability to talk about and articulate what you learned. So we do that. We, again, would have some discussion around the markets. My sister was and still is a superb pianist, so she'd often be playing a little music. So it was a very interesting kind of very solid upbringing with very, very little money. And I don't think that exists much anymore when sort of lower middle class folks would have the advantage at home of having this sort of range of conversations. My parents were also big believers in getting two newspapers. We got the Washington Post, which came in the morning, and the Evening Star, which came in the evening. And what was in the newspaper was much discussed, including particularly a guy named Hobart Rowan, who wrote a financial column. That was something that my father and I talked about every week as well.
I wish I had been invited over to dinner. That sounds like it would have been wonderful. Now, you mentioned financial literacy, and as a young man, 8th grade, you were involved in balancing the checkbook. How did that experience of being intimately involved with something as important as that shape your thinking as you grew older?
In 2 or 3 different ways. One is I've already indicated that I became very interested in interest rates and things of that nature. And so in 1966 or 67, when Lyndon Johnson nominated Andrew Bremer to be the first African-American governor of the Fed, I was really fascinated because I'd been talking to my father about interest rates in this sort of very informal but natural way. And suddenly this institution I had never heard of was one that set interest rates. So I suddenly figured out, oh my goodness, this is a place that actually does this thing that impresses my father so much. So, you can see how that sort of led through. The second was this notion that has become known as financial literacy, and in some sense how hard it is to achieve that. I was just talking to someone today, interviewing someone for a job with our company, and we were talking about why is it the level of financial literacy is so low, and I think the answer is it's a rare family in which anyone feels particularly comfortable talking about money as just a natural part of your life, the way my father did, and that has sort of led me to have this passion around how do we create, a higher degree of financial literacy in the world, and that's clearly sort of stuck with me. And then this notion of, what did you learn today? The concept of continuous education, in economics we call building your human capital, as being something that you really should, pay attention to, and not stop learning. The other thing about my father and mother was, though we had very little money, my father in particular liked to give us unusual experiences. And so I distinctly remember one Saturday he disappeared for a little while and came home, and he came back with these round, very hard donuts and this pink, fishy stuff that some people would know today as lox and bagels. But you have to imagine this sort of lower middle class African-American family with this kid with this afro and these big Coke bottle glasses, having lox and bagels on Saturday like we were, citizens of the world. And this is just what my parents did. It was just, again, I keep marveling at it because it wasn't about the money, it was about the intentfulness of giving us experiences in a world that frankly was quite segregated. And so all those gifts have sort of stuck with me. What did you learn today? Financial literacy, new experiences, not being afraid to learn new things as you get older in life. And all that came from just the way my parents behaved, and particularly also hard work. I mean, they were phenomenally hard workers. So it's that range of stuff that matters.
And how did you inculcate your own family with these values that you were the beneficiaries with your parents?
You should ask them. Right? So without a doubt, education is everything. It's still in my family, and I'm proud to say that my son is going to business school. At a point, there was an article in today's Wall Street Journal about the decline of applications in business school among millennials, and I'm really pleased to see my son decided to take some time off of his young career to do that. My daughter is going I don't think she'd mind me admitting she's going to the University of Chicago here.
I don't mind you admitting that.
Yeah. Hey, you should. Right. Great school. And she's getting both a law degree and a PhD in government. So, education is everything to us, and it still is education is everything to them. I think their degree of financial literacy is better than average. But I will say I'm just stunned at young people. Why actually am I stunned at it? The casual approach that they take to money. So whenever my kids owe me any money, or whenever they choose to pay me money, they owe me money all the time. They transfer it by Venmo. I don't know, how many of you have young adults in your family? How many of you know Venmo? How many of you are surprised that in Venmo you can see not just that money was transferred, but the exact amount? I mean, why do I need to know that my son paid $2.50 to pay one of his friends something? So they are very modern in their approach to finances. And they are certainly willing to tell us on a day-to-day basis what new thing they learned. And they are really excited about this whole notion, not just of formal education, but informal education. Mm-hmm. So many of these same things that I learned, I think they've sort of picked up either by osmosis or explicitly having to be something that we discussed with them. Mm-hmm.
So let's take the next step in your journey. Looking back, was there a point when you saw yourself pulling ahead of the pack? And what I mean by that, you've had, as we mentioned, very rich educational opportunities at Harvard. You've worked for many academy companies, premier law firm. Was there any moment when you thought to yourself, maybe I can make a significant difference? Maybe I am going to be able to lead and make an impact?
I never thought explicitly about maybe I can lead, but I always thought that my goal in life and the reason that we're here is to make the world a somewhat better place. I also always believed in the value of doing whatever job you were assigned to the best of your abilities. My first paying job, my work-study job at Harvard was cleaning bathrooms. This was not the job of glamour, to put it mildly. But I took it really seriously, and in fact, though I can't find it today, I got a letter from some of my classmates about how well I had cleaned up their bathroom after a particularly raucous weekend. You don't need to hear more than that. But and so my approach to life is not maybe I can lead. My approach to life is maybe I can contribute, maybe I can do things, make things a little better. And whatever I do, I've got to work really hard at the current job in order to get the right to do the next job. I've subsequently developed a theory of leadership as I've been promoted into roles. I had to figure out what it is to be a leader. But I didn't start ever thinking of myself as a leader. It just, because of hard work and a lot of good fortune and education, I had the great pleasure of getting promoted into roles of leadership, and now I have figured out a little theory of what it is to do.
So did you see other people see you in a leadership role before you did, or helped you define yourself in terms of your potential or long-term ability?
So the answer to that question is there are a number of people who gave me opportunities and who reinforced some of the ideas that I had. There was a really still close to her now, a woman, she was an associate professor at Harvard named Elizabeth Allison, who when I was leaving college or getting ready to graduate from college, couldn't quite figure out what I wanted to do. And she was the one who planted the notion that maybe I could get a PhD in economics. I loved economics, as I still do, but I couldn't imagine myself getting that last degree. And she suggested I could do it, maybe do it with a JD, and that just became the passion that drove me for the next 7 or 8 years. There was a partner at McKinsey & Company, and my path at McKinsey was not straight, believe me, who grabbed me after I'd had a particularly rough time and put me in a slightly different role that propelled me allowed me, again, propelled is too strong, allowed me to finally get into the partnership there. There's a guy named Jim Goodrich. Wouldn't have heard of him either. And then the last person, ironically, was Alan Greenspan, a name you may have heard of. And Alan was not eager to have me join the Board of Governors, I'm told, by many people, because he just simply didn't know me. There are a bunch of great economists in America, and of all those great economists, Bill Clinton chose me, this not particularly well-known guy. But what Alan did for me, which was spectacular, and he does this for everybody, he was very, very fair. He just observed me moving along in my role as governor. He saw me working really hard. He saw me contributing in places that were far from the glamour of monetary policy, but proved later to be important. And when it came time to appoint someone vice chairman, he went to the president and said, Ferguson, which was a stunner because I'd only been there 2 years, and the president well recalled that Alan was not, and it's not in any bad way, didn't know me. And so the fact that he actually saw me work and thought, gee, maybe could be sort of promoted to a bit of a leadership role. So there have been a few people who have just along the way have either supported me, encouraged crazy ideas, or found ways to move me along. And one is always grateful for those sorts of things.
Have you stayed in touch with them, or do you?
Yes, less so with Jim Goodrich, just for different reasons. But Elizabeth Allison and her husband, Graham Allison, who used to be dean of the Kennedy School, are still friends, and I see Alan Greenspan for lunch about once every quarter or so. Yeah. And we see each other otherwise. He's great. He's 92 years old, and every time I see him, he's working on yet another book. He's developed some new theory of how to look at the data, and he's got this book coming out.
That's called hard work.
That's called hard work, and it's called passion. And and for him, it's not work. It's the man he is.
So let's talk for a moment about core values. I know core values define an individual as the person that they are. And there are some important core values that I think I've observed in learning about you that you've lived. And one of the most important, let's start with, is diversity and inclusion. Right. I think you've committed your life to making sure that you provide opportunities and important opportunities for all people in all levels of your organization. And that kind of builds on one of the questions that somebody in the audience proposed in talking about how you think about diversity and inclusion in the context of TIAA as the CEO.
Well, first, with our company, TIAA, one has to recognize this is part of our legacy and our history. We had the first woman on the board of a Fortune 100 company in the 1940s, first African-American officer of a major insurance company in the 1950s. My predecessor, Cliff Warden, was the first African-American CEO of a Fortune 100 company. So the first thing in the context of my company is diversity and inclusion are bedrock of who we are and what we stand for. Secondly, in the modern era, it's, as it has always been, it's obviously sort of the right thing to do, right? There's no one now, I think, who sort of would push and doubt that. But the third thing is there's increasing evidence, quantitative science, economic science kind of evidence, that diverse and inclusive organizations, first diverse and inclusive teams make better decisions, and organizations composed of such teams end up having better financial performance. There's a book from a professor at the University of Michigan, who's a professor of economics, law, and computer science, or 2 or 3 different things, named Scott Page, who's validated all this. So, if you're responsible, as we are, for the life savings of 5 million Americans, you want to make the best possible decisions. Mm-hmm. And if it turns out, even if you didn't think it was part of our legacy, if you didn't think it was the right thing to do, but you just wanted to do the right thing in terms of making money for people, you don't have diverse and inclusive teams. And it paid off really well for us just before the economic crisis started, because there was a lot of tension in the organization about these subprime investments. And because we had very inclusive voices speaking honestly about how they saw the risks, we managed to de-risk our portfolio not long, but before the crisis got underway. So there's a real value to having folks who aren't in groupthink and who are going to come in with a diverse point of view, but be included in the conversation. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Another core value you lived is financial security in the context of your. Can you start by giving us a definition how do you define what financial security is?
Financial security at the extreme is not having to worry about whether or not you have the resources to live the life that you want to live. And that's at the extreme, because there's some folks for whom there's no such thing, right? We just need more and more and more. But for the average, appropriately calibrated individual around money, financial security is I've got ample resources to handle the obvious needs and some uncertainties that will hit in the world. It's well known now, I think this stat is about 40% of households couldn't put their hands on $400, some phrase of that sort, some number of that sort, which clearly shows the degree of financial insecurity in the world. My business is all about creating financial wellness and financial security for people to and through retirement, through every life stage, and that is what we do. And we've got a bunch of Nuveen colleagues here, and their job is to bring that to life by investing actually $1.2 trillion of money that we manage and administer for the best possible risk-adjusted returns. Mm-hmm. I must say, when I see so many of them here, I wonder who's looking after my portfolio, but we're pleased you're here. We're pleased you're here. And so we're in the business of creating financial wellness and financial security because of our great colleagues in Chicago and other places who are part of the asset management business. Part of this comes back to my father. One thing I actually don't say much about with him is, though he didn't have very much money, he managed to retire, I think he was 56 or 57, which is stunning. I mean, I couldn't imagine retiring, even though I'd lead a retirement organization for a long, long time. But he could do it because of all these little, move this $500 here and this $1,000 there and go for the extra 25 basis points. And he lived a really good, long, highly secure life because he had focused in on saving and investing at a relatively young age. So I got to see the benefit of long-term thinking in creating financial security for a person who I think probably never made more than $28,000 a year or something. Now, the other thing about him, he was phenomenally frugal, to put it mildly. And so if you have the very first penny that you made and you invest it wisely, you will actually be financially secure. I can promise you that.
Mm-hmm. I was just looking at one of the questions from the audience, and it says, who do you lean on for financial advice? Obviously, you've learned a great deal from your father, and that is part of who you are.
Oh, right now I lean on a number of my colleagues at TIAA and Nuveen. We have an advisory group. We have a very good trust company that's headquartered in St. Louis. I have a team, an individual that does my asset allocation. And so, though I'm deeply interested in financial literacy and financial well-being, my financial well-being is totally in the hands of a team of 4 or 5 people. Mm-hmm. One of the things I really like that we've done is I've asked them to bring in a next generation advisor who's closer to the age of my children. And so actually at this stage, core financial advisor is probably 36 years old. And I don't think I should mention his name, but he came to the U.S. from Belarus, and again sees the world in a way that's not that of a person who grew up here in the U.S. I just enjoy talking to him because he's this. Not only is he the next generation of financial advisors for us, wealth management advisors, but he's got a very, very creative and different point of view of thinking about these things. So my entire future is in the hands of other people. And
again, the importance of diversity.
Absolutely.
And putting the right people around the table with diverse ideas and experience.
And age. I asked them, because my other advisors are roughly my age, maybe 10 years younger. I said, give me somebody who's next generation, who thinks about the world very differently. Mm. And we've got this, I think he's 35, 36, he just had a second kid. Great, I just love it, it's wonderful.
That's called diversity and inclusion right there.
It's also calling trust.
Yes, very, very, absolutely.
I've worked all my life to make this money. I'm now giving it to this 36-year-old kid. Please don't screw it up.
I remember clients once said that to me when he had given me an executive search. He said, please don't screw it up. I said, I promise, I won't.
Don't worry.
There's another question here that I thought was interesting. Could you tell us about what drew TIAA to invest in Nuveen? Kind of taking a step back, but kind of share that thought process with us.
Sure. So it was a 2 or 3-pronged decision process. First was thinking about ways to grow and diversify this great company that is the world's leader in retirement, and making sure that we have a balanced organization as opposed to being just a retirement monoline. So the first step was to say, gee, one of the things that we have done really well at TIAA is we invest people's money. We're a 101-year-old company now, so 101 years ago, Andrew Carnegie gave us some money to invest and others started, so we had the skill at investing. But I decided I wanted to turn that into a business, not a utility only for our folks who save. So that was the first stage, deciding that we wanted to have an investment business. Then the second stage was finding an investment operation that met a number of criteria that I think was really important. One is to have a pristine brand name, backed by a history, because this is a very cyclical business and a company that could survive through the ups and downs was important to me. Secondly was to have a company that had a specialty in areas that I thought would be protected from some of the forces that are driving asset management, i.e. that you really sort of owned an asset class, so to speak, and it's obvious that Nuveen owns several, munis most famously, but also closed-end funds and other things. And the third, which I think folks in Chicago haven't thought much about, but Nuveen actually, when we acquired them, had not just the big Nuveen asset management team here, but credible position in equities and a number of other investment boutiques, each one of whom had a specialty. Mm-hmm. And so Nuveen owns, and we now own Gresham, for example, which does commodities. And the final part of it was I also wanted to have, back to diversity and inclusion, diverse portfolios that complemented what we did so well on the legacy side of TIAA. And what TIAA does so well is alternatives, real estate, ag, timber. We were already a scale there. Very well on equities, as does Nuveen, and a number of income-type products, which would leverage quite nicely with what Nuveen does. And so, as we scoured literally the world for asset management companies that would hit these various criteria, there was one that popped to the top. And it turned out to be available at a price that turned out to be a price that we were happy to pay, and it turns out, I think, to have been justified.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back to the conversation about core values for a moment? Mm-hmm. You've mentioned many times the importance of education in your life, going back to your mother. It was discussed in the family. You're the beneficiary of it. When I was reading that about you, I actually paused to think of myself for a moment, and I, too, was the beneficiary of an excellent education. I always tell the story that my grandmother was an Italian immigrant, came to this country, and could not read or write. The tradition in Italy was the oldest daughter cared for the rest of the family, of which there were 9. And I can remember as a young woman sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table and devising a color code for her to use the rotary phone. And we put together a phone book and a picture of my father, and then green, green, blue, the numbers.
Wow.
And it's always stuck with me about the luxury that I've had, the importance of this. I know you're a very serious student of higher education. Mm-hmm. What do you think are the most important issue, or the one most important? Because there are many. Freedom of expression, barriers to admissions, cost. If we, as the leaders in the Chicago business community, wanted to be focusing on one.
So I did a study led with my good friend Mike McPherson, who used to live here in Chicago, on the future of undergraduate education. And there are many issues as you confront, as you talk about. I think the biggest one, though, is completion. We've now cracked the nut around getting people to graduate from high school. We've actually, now about 90% of high school graduates have some exposure to higher ed, but only about 60% actually complete. And among minority communities, the percentage of completion is much lower. And so while these other issues are important about affordability and access and freedom of speech and not taking any of those things away, I think the most important thing is the role that we have to support, for which we have to support higher ed, is to get all those folks who start to complete. Mm-hmm. It's a big difference between having 2 years of higher education and potentially the debt that goes along with it versus 4 years of higher education and potentially the debt that goes along with it. And if we can get completion rates up, that has a big impact. We used Moody's Analytics to do their big macro model, and it turns out that getting completion rates up works very much like an infrastructure investment. Very expensive, relatively expensive up front, but pays off in terms of increasing the growth rate and the size of the economy 20 years down the road. And so, I really would drive that. Not to take away from all these other things that are hard social nuts to crack and other things, but leveraging the best practices around driving completion, I think, would be, pay huge dividends for both the individuals and for society overall.
And as you take that next step with that objective, do you have any ideas that we can think about as we leave here today to how to satisfy that objective?
Oh, sure. There are a number, the other reason I talk about completion is there actually are a number of models around the country on what it takes, particularly for disadvantaged minorities, to complete schools. There's something called Pathways, which is used. CUNY, University of Georgia, has done used big data to help figure out what it takes to get people to complete. And it turns out that what you need to do is give them the pathways. A lot of first-generation kids, a lot of minorities have had no exposure to what it is to get into a great 4-year school and finish it. And so helping them to figure out what a set of courses look like is critical to them. Watching them almost literally from day to day, if not week to week, and certainly semester to semester is very important. Getting them to understand the value of going to things like office hours and asking for help. Those of us who went to great schools know you go and talk to the teacher if you don't understand something. You'd be surprised at how rare that is if you haven't gone to that kind of environment. And frankly, having a safety net, particularly for some, where an accident, a car that doesn't work could be the difference between being in class and not in class. So creating those sorts of safety nets for the emergencies that the rest of us, simply write a check for. So there are a number of can-do tools that would help create much better outcomes that ultimately pay dividends for individuals and for society overall. And the reason I touch on it is it's not as contentious as access. It's not as frustrating and contentious as the cost of education. It's ultimately something we can all do that everyone would think is right. Once you get into school, everyone would think you should complete. Mm-hmm. If you think schools are a hotbed of left-wing cabals, or if you think they're just sort of, outrageously expensive, whatever you may think about higher ed, everyone has to think, once you get in, you should get out. That is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And so another reason I focus on it is it's hard for me to imagine people saying, no, that's not a good idea. Right? I like to focus on things that have practical solutions that make the world a better place, and in this environment that we can all coalesce around, as opposed to having to be divisive.
And measurable.
And absolutely measurable.
So let's turn for a moment to think and talk about leadership, which we all know is very, very important. Mm-hmm. There's a faculty member at the University of Chicago, Steve Kaplan, at the Booth School of Business, that has spent a great deal of time looking at leadership and characteristics of a CEO. And his hypothesis is that sometimes the characteristics of a CEO are different from the characteristics of a C-suite. Can you talk about, as you think about, what are the most important characteristics as you've learned and stepped into these roles and made an impact?
So back to the notion of maybe flipping things around a little bit, I've come to the conclusion that leadership is really all about followership, which is to say, if you think you're a leader and you look over your shoulder and no one is following you, you're out there by yourself. You may be an entertainer, but you're not a leader. And so from that, I've developed, what are the things that would make someone appealing enough that others want to follow that individual? And it strikes me, just an observation, there are 4 traits that allow leaders to be leaders, i.e. to engender followership. One of them has got to be expertise. Folks don't want to follow someone who's a novice at everything. And expertise does not necessarily mean you stayed in school and got that advanced degree. It could be deep expertise on how this company operates, or deep expertise on what our customers want. But some expertise, that McKinsey used to call it a spike. What's that one thing that people think about that differentiates you from others? So that's one. The second is the ability to articulate where you want to go. Folks are not going to follow a leader if the leader can't articulate in some compelling, clear fashion, where do you want to go? We're confronting this a little bit in my own company now. We have been on a journey called Vision 2020. The acquisition of Nuveen was a big step in that. As we get closer to 2020, the company say, well, where are we going to go now? And so there's a hungering always to have a sense of where does that leader want you to go? And you can buy in or not, but at least be clear. The third is one that I think surprises people, which is empathy. Right? We often think of leaders as stand up and show no weakness. My sense is if you want to engender followership, folks don't want to be treated like cogs in some big machine that you have planned. They want to be treated like human beings, so be empathetic. And I actually got that a little bit from Colin Powell, who is a great leader. And he said to me, Roger, in the military, it's not aye, sir. It is aye, sir, and then you go out and do what you want. No, not that people are subordinate, but the amount of energy you put into following orders depends on how people feel. Mm-hmm. And so empathy is really important. People have lives. It'd be nice to think that we're all work, a la robots 24/7, but that's just not the way it works. And the final thing is fortitude, right? You don't want a leader who is the first one to panic when things go wrong. Oh, that's comforting, right? So obviously I learned that at 9/11, right? There comes a point where calm, fortitude, when all else fails and everyone else is in frantic mode, helps you be a bit of a leader. So those are some theories I've developed. There are a bunch of other theories around leadership. The final thing is it's got to be authentic to who you are, right? So those are the things that I find sort of work for me and feel natural to me. that might not be a style of leadership that works for 250 people in this room. Well, that's the way I think about it.
There's a very important issue today that was generated from the Business Roundtable, chaired by Jamie Dimon. And as they looked at their mission to be more inclusive, or I should say more elastic, to include more than just the shareholders, but stockholders as well, and to think of employees, customers, the actual community.
Right.
Can you give us your thoughts about that and how you, if you believe in it and is supportive of that broader definition of stakeholders, how you've included that in your leadership at TIAA?
So I do believe in this. There was an article I wrote years and years ago with a guy named Kevin Coyne and McKinsey Quarterly or something around just this topic. Two, one should observe that it is an interesting and contentious topic, right? Because when the Business Roundtable came out their statement, there was a lot of pushback from others saying, no, you're only in business to make money. Three, one should recognize the two things go hand in hand. You are only going to make money sustainably, I believe, if you take these other things into consideration. How does that play at TIAA? Well, first, we've always had this point of view, and so we, as an investment organization, even before the Nuveen acquisition, have worked really hard on ESG issues for the companies that we own, whose stock we own. We engage with them on how they think about these topics. We've been pushing really hard on diversity in the boardroom, for example. We've been pushing very hard on companies that are in carbon-intensive industries to talk about how they at least think about their carbon footprint. We got a very nice article in Barron's 2 or 3 months ago about how we avoided making an investment in the company because we didn't like the governance, and that proved to be the right thing because their stock came off a bit. And so, we absolutely believe in bringing that range of stakeholder values into our investment thesis. And so that's, clearly important. Secondly, I firmly believe, particularly for an investment-oriented activity, that you have to have a long-term perspective. Mm-hmm. Now, we are very fortunate at TIAA, which is that we are not a publicly traded company. We're owned by the people who save and invest and retire with us. We call them our participants. That allows us to put their interest ahead and allows us to think about long-term investment strategies as opposed to having to worry about quarter-to-quarter approaches. And so we always have in mind this notion of having stakeholders, participants who also have a long-term interest, and that's critical to who we are and what we do. And the third thing is we are fortunate enough to be able to make long-term investments. So we talked about the Nuveen acquisition. That was obviously meant to be forever, but as the Nuveen team knows, when we first acquired Nuveen, we left them alone for a year or two. Didn't immediately crunch things together and start moving around. If we had a shorter-term perspective and if we had promised a certain amount of this or that, savings or revenue increase, there would have been a lot of pressure to move, I think, too quickly. We took a decision, we did, that Nuveen was functioning very well. Let's let this unfold naturally, and now we're bringing the organization together in a way that feels much more organic and natural. That would not have been the case if we had to worry about short-termism and been really focused on anything other than what's good for the people. A reason to move very slowly as well is when you acquire an asset management business, you are acquiring talent. Mm-hmm. And I did not want to move quickly and chase away all that great investment talent at Nuveen that had been the source of, or the rationale for buying the organization. So thinking about our employees as central to who we are allowed us to take a longer-term view of how we're going to do that acquisition. I bring it up because obviously it's very relevant here in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So lots of ways that we think about that set of stakeholders as being an important part of how we try to run the company.
I was just looking at a question from the audience, and may I read it? What is your outlook for the economy and financial markets of 2019 into 2020? You knew we couldn't let you get away with asking this question.
And so I think the outlook for financial markets, maybe I think ours, is the phrase I think we're sort of using is that the journey gets a little harder. And what does that mean? We've seen phenomenal performance in almost every asset class. There's some talk in the market that that might be disrupted as the economy turns. So I think what we see, at least what I see, is probably somewhat slower growth in 2020, but still positive. I don't think we're going to sort of fall into a recession, but I think the growth is going to be relatively muted. And having said that, I still think there will continue to be search for really good returns. I think many asset classes will continue to rise, but maybe not at the same breakneck speed that we've seen of late. And I think all of that is just sort of consistent with both an economy that's sort of growing but more slowly, and the fact that I think central banks, I tend to think around interest rates and central bank activities, are going to be cautious, both sides. Inflation doesn't look like it's about to break out, so I don't think many central banks are going to be moving aggressively up, which would slow things down, obviously, in markets. At the same time, interest rates are already relatively low. We're experimenting with even negative rates. I don't think most central banks want to move much further in that direction. And that's not a forecast of what the Fed's going to do. I don't know what they're going to do. But if interest rates don't change dramatically in one way or the other, and the economy globally and in the U.S. continues to chug along at a modest rate, then I think that's going to be, generally speaking, supportive for most asset classes, even though many of them are relatively high and fully priced, and even though many people worry that this has been a very, very long expansion, very, very long bull market, it doesn't necessarily have to sort of come crashing to an end next year.
Mm-hmm. Can we turn for a moment to talk about technology? You, as I mentioned, serve on the corporate board of Alphabet, which has helped to develop advanced machine learning as well as artificial intelligence and other areas of technology. As a CEO, what is your relationship with technology?
Ambivalent. So why do I say that as a CEO? First thing you have to recognize, for a large Fortune 100 company, technology is incredibly expensive. And I think there are very few of us sitting in a CEO suite who can say, I really understand that deeply, right? It's quite different from in my case. I understand not what all of my Nuveen colleagues do, but I have a general understanding of an investment process. Obviously, I have a general understanding of an HR process. I'm a lawyer by training, so law, regulation, that kind of stuff count me, generally speaking, familiar. I understand a lot of what we do in the retirement space. Technology, even though I'm on the board of Alphabet, is still, for all of us, a little bit of a black box. Costs a lot, what am I getting for it? So that's the cautious part. The other part is financial services companies are very much at their heart technology companies. It's how we deliver a lot of the services to individuals, right? It's all now about our apps. We're bringing AI into our investment process, so it's going to be how we generate value. Obviously, it's how we communicate. And so, one has got to be really embracing of technology, even as one doesn't fully understand all of it, because that is really who we are, what we stand for. We are a very large processing organization. We do record keeping for retirement. That's a technology-driven business. It's got some manual components to it, but we're adopting a lot of bots to help us automate routinized work. And so I think most CEOs, I can only speak for myself, I only know one well, look at technology in this, we have to embrace it. It's really central to who we are. And at the same time, it's big, it's expensive, it's an area that most of us didn't grow up in. In that sense, that's why I use the word ambivalent. I love it, it's central, I'm on the board of Alphabet. I use it as best I can. And yet it's a pretty expensive part of the operation, and it's hard to make sure that we have it just right. Unlike a lot of other things where I feel, I sort of grew up in that, I sort of understand it.
That was a thoughtful, insightful answer.
Was that a scary admission? What did he say?
I've been spanning many of the questions that are coming up from the audience, and there's several references to a retirement crisis.
Right. So,
give us your perspective on
Yep, absolutely. So I think of this as a retirement challenge. If we don't act, it will become a retirement crisis. What are the elements of retirement challenge? First, demographics. Aging baby boomers, by definition, getting closer and closer to retirement. 10,000 baby boomers hit 65, the legacy retirement age, every day. And so you can see that this is mounting. Second reason why it's a challenge is the decline of the defined benefit plan and the rise of the 401k. The 401k was never meant to be a retirement plan. It was meant to be a supplemental plan. And yet for many, it is the source of their retirement savings. Third is too little retirement savings. My former colleagues and still friends of the Fed, I think, have estimated that the shortfall in retirement savings is $4, $5, $6, $7 trillion, huge. And then final component of it is the bedrock retirement savings vehicle and publicly provided annuity for everybody is Social Security. And the Social Security trustees have already said that the trust fund, as it's called, will be depleted in 2035, I think. So 4 components of a challenge. Reason it's not yet a crisis is we can move on some of those components and start to resolve them. So the government, the House, the Senate, the President can resolve the Social Security issue through a number of technical fixes, which I won't bore everybody with, but we know a path for it there. We know what a good DC plan looks like because, if I may do a bold ad for TIAA, we are the world's best DC-DB hybrid plan. We show people every day how to get safely to and through retirement in a DC-type mode. And so if the rest of the world would just simply adopt our model, they would be, No, I'd say that only, it was said in a funny way, but it is a very serious statement. We've been doing this for 100 years. We know how to merge DC, DB to get to the best outcomes. Savings, we also know a great deal about what the right savings rate needs to be. Not easy to get everybody to that stage. So one of these things that I can't fix is the aging population, or that we as society can't fix is the aging population, with one exception. For anyone in this room who is of childbearing age, I would encourage you to have 3 kids because the replacement ratio is 2.1. And we can't round to that 1.1. And so if you have millennial children in your family who are married, encourage them to have 3 kids because they will then support all of us. And again, you laugh, but that's a very serious comment. And I've got a millennial, close to millennial friend close to me here, and he knows full well that what I said is what I say to everybody. I'm on this drumbeat about 3 kids for young people, increase savings, fix Social Security, and adopt the DB-DC hybrid model of TIAA, and we'll take care of these problems.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to ask one last question that I love to end my interviews with when I talk to someone. What would you like to pass on to the next generation?
Oh, my goodness, so many things. I would like to pass on fundamentally a better world, if that makes sense. So much of my life has been working really hard to try to make things better in small incremental ways. I never thought of myself as like changing the world, because what arrogance would that be? But doing everything I do, hopefully, to contribute to making the world a better place. And I really do think there are ways we can make the world a better place. One of the reasons I care a lot about education is it is proven to be a great way to make the world a better place. One of the reasons I care about financial security, financial literacy, is you can't focus on other things if, among other weaknesses you have, you're financially insecure. The reason I care so much about diversity and inclusion is we live in a diverse space. If we don't figure out how to become more inclusive, we leave so many people behind. The reason I care about gender and gender equity is 50% of the population is female. Women are going to inherit most of the money. If we haven't figured out how to bring them into the space, then we're leaving behind a huge amount of productivity capability. The reason I care about technology is technology has historically driven increased productivity, which lifts everybody out of poverty. So all these things that we've talked about and that I've spent some time with are all around creating the conditions for making the world a better place in ways that are not mysterious. All right? I'm not a rocket scientist, but I can examine and think about history and what seems to work, and then let's figure out how we do that better. I'm on the board of the Smithsonian because it is a phenomenal repository of knowledge education that's free to everybody. I'm on the board of Memorial Sloan Kettering because they are bringing technology to healthcare in one of the great scourges of older people, which is cancer. And so everything about my life is trying to piece together the various components that, if we can get them working in a positive ecosystem, can actually make the world a better place without, doing one big thing, because I'm not capable of one big thing. I'm too stupid. So I can do a bunch of small things. So that's what I'm trying to do.
You've demonstrated to us you do live a life of purpose and consequence. We admire you for that very much. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks.